What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today I'm going to be talking about my preferred ways to draft a 180 card cube with 2 or 4 players. Originally, I was going to title this episode something like Drafting with 2 or 4, but I figured I may as well just offer Minneapolis Draft in the title. I don't think it's going to be massively surprising, as this is a draft format that I personally came up with, but it's been a few years since I have drafted with 2 players using any other method. There's a lot about this draft style that really clicks for me that I really like, and I'm going to go over both how to draft Minneapolis Draft and why I find it appealing and so replayable today. And then I'll be going over how I approach drafting with 4 players. That one is probably nothing too special, nothing that you haven't heard before, but it's still worth going over. And I also think that there's a lot of value specifically in the discussion and the significance of drafting a 180 card cube with 4 players where you actually see every card in the draft. And that's more where I see the value in talking about 4 player drafts today. But first things first, let's talk about Minneapolis drafting with 2 players. Of course, the first thing you have to do before you can cube with any number of people is shuffle or randomize your cube. I'm not going to talk about the best ways to do that. More than that, I just really quickly want to call out something that you should not do when shuffling a cube, because I think this is something that happens in every cube group. The one thing you don't want to do is grab a small section of the cube and really shuffle it thoroughly. You really hold one stack of the cube for a long time and shuffle it like a deck. Because all you're doing is preventing that section of the cube from being shuffled with any other section of the cube. This happened to me last week when I was drafting just against one friend. We were doing a 2 player draft, and I was trying to shuffle the cube, and he just started shuffling this one stack, and it's like more harmful than helpful when it comes to actually randomizing. I'm sure if you own a cube, you've had this happen all the time where you're shuffling and somebody asks if they can help, and it's like, well, are you actually going to help or are you going to hold part of the cube hostage while I'm trying to randomize the whole thing? Just to kind of expand on that. When you are shuffling just a small stack of the cube, you can shuffle that exact stack of cards, and that stack of cards will be really randomized as if you were drawing it from a deck, but none of those cards are getting shuffled into the cube. So part of what you're doing when you're shuffling a cube, like the last thing you did with it was draft, right? And so you're putting decks back together, and then you have to reshuffle it until it's a randomized stack so you can draft it like a cube again. And if you just grab a stack of it and shuffle it, you are just shuffling that deck. What you need to be doing is getting the cards from that deck and dispersing them throughout the rest of the cube. You're trying to get a good distribution of colors, and like if a deck is 2 or 3 colors, you're just shuffling cards that you already know are a small sampling of colors. So you want to be exchanging half of your stack with a different chunk of cards from the cube, and make sure you're moving all the parts around so you're actually shuffling every part of the cube with every other part of the cube. And I don't think that people that do this mean any harm, like they're trying to be helpful, but they're not being helpful. And that's why I want to call it out, because it is something that you should not do when somebody's shuffling the cube. Certainly within a 180 card cube, it's realistically a one-person job. There's ways to do it together, but just grabbing a chunk and shuffling it extensively is not a way to do it. And I also understand that there's people that kind of have a compulsion or it just feels nice to shuffle cards. And if that's the case, you can absolutely do that, but maybe bring your own cards from home to shuffle while people actually randomize the cube. I've definitely had that conversation more than once with the person who will grab a chunk of the cube and just kind of stare off into space while they shuffle that one chunk. And you can just offer them to shuffle the basic lands if there's something else for them to fidget with. They get something to play with, which is what they actually want, and you actually get to randomize the cube. Okay, so now back to Minneapolis Draft specifically. You're going to have 2 players, and what you're each going to do is make 8 7-card packs. So 8 piles of 7 cards, keep them distinct to be drafted individually. And then you simultaneously open and draft those packs. So you open your 7-card pack, you're going to take one first pick. You then trade packs with the other player. You might hear me refer to them as your opponent today. You'll have 6 cards now. You take 2 of those, and then you trade packs back. You'll now be looking at 4 cards. These are going to be 4 of the cards you originally opened. Your opponent has now drafted 2 of them, and you have your first pick. And you're going to take 2 of those 4 cards. And then the last 2 cards are set aside. They are removed from the draft. So I like to do this where all of the draft picks are face down. Because the second picks, when you trade and you take 2 cards out of the 6 card pack, because that's derived information, you know what you passed and you're going to get the pack passed back. I've seen some people draft those second 2 cards face up because it eliminates the guesswork. You are going to know what's in that pack. Technically, you could write down every card that you opened and then you'd be able to derive what was taken that way. So you know what those second 2 cards are. And that's a fine way to do it. Personally, I like doing it face down, just has a better feel. I get to pick up my pile and look through my entire draft pool. It's something that I enjoy doing during draft, but you can put them face up. And when you're teaching somebody or just playing against somebody newer to Magic, or even if you're just going for a more relaxed atmosphere, it can be good to do these kind of things where, okay, this is known information. We can just play it face up so it's easier to understand what's going on. Alright, so drafting 1 card, 2 cards, 2 cards, setting the last 2 cards aside from every 7-card pack. We drafted our first pack, that means that we have 5 cards each for us and our opponent, and then you just draft the next pack until you've drafted all 8. So you're going to end up with 40 cards in your draft pool, and then it's time to build a deck. And that took all of 2 minutes to explain. So really approachable, really easy to understand. I like that aspect of this. I do think it's significant that you end up with 40 cards, which is very close to the number of cards you're going to end up with in a retail booster draft environment. If you draft with 8 and you're drafting 14-card packs, you end up with 42 cards, so you're very close to that. And because of that, the tensions in deck construction are very similar to retail limited. You only have so many picks that you could use to make some kind of speculative choice. You do have to figure out your colors. And sometimes you end up in a spot where you have a couple interesting sideboard cards or deck building decisions, and sometimes you're scraping to get that 23rd card and maintaining that kind of tension. That's actually a really big part of why I enjoy Minneapolis Draft so much, is there are a lot of elements that go into making this draft feel like a draft with 8 players, even though you're only playing with 2. And I'm going to go into more of the particulars because the card number is just the very basic aspect of that. So there's actually a lot more going on in the method that simulates having more players at the draft table. The other aspect of this draft style that immediately stands out as being similar to retail booster draft is that you open up a pack and you get 1 first pick. I really enjoy that element to draft, just looking at a pack and saying, okay, I get 1 of these cards. Which of these 1 cards is going to give me the best shot of building a nice deck? Which of these cards can I pass, and what signals am I sending to my opponent? And sending and reading signals in that way is a fundamental aspect of Minneapolis Draft. You got to think about, okay, if I pass 2 red cards, is my opponent just going to take this pair of red cards that I've passed? Do I want to be in red? Are these 2 red cards so good that I want to get 1 and I want to try to get the other one back? What happens if I pass the red cards and my opponent doesn't take them? There's so many layers to it. And it feels very similar to the layers you think about with an 8-person table, except you're just considering signals to exactly 1 person, and you immediately get a ton of information about what they're doing when you get that pack back and you see which 2 cards that they drafted. So you both are shaping your deck very quickly and getting a lot of information about what your opponent is up to very quickly. I love that. This aspect of drafting against the other player or players at the table is something that I really enjoy and that I want to reward navigating well in my draft environment. I want you to be rewarded if you determine correctly what cards your opponent is going to draft out of a given pack. I want you to be able to read their signals, to send signals in your own draft picks that influence the way that they're going to draft. And then as you navigate the packs, as you go through the draft, you start to determine, okay, in pack 1 and pack 2, my opponent has passed every blue card that I've seen. And maybe they're not the strongest cards in the pack, but if all of the cards are 1 color coming back around, you start to make the connection, okay, if they open a strong blue card, they probably can't take it anymore. If they haven't taken any blue cards after a couple of packs, it seems very likely that any blue card that they open is going to come my way. And just reading into that kind of stuff and navigating that strategy is something that I want to reward players for doing well, because that's a huge aspect of drafting. That's what I find fun about drafting, is figuring out what cards you're going to get on the way back. Opening a nice card is great. It's fun to open and windmill slam a strong card. That's why I value having the 1 first pick so highly. But that's really just a form of variance, and I do want there to be some skill expression in the actual draft format. And that's also an aspect of the last two picks and the two cards removed from the draft being face down. I like having to track that information a little bit, be aware of what you've passed in those last four cards without knowing to an absolute certainty which two your opponent picked up. This leaves a little uncertainty about what colors or what kind of deck they're trying to draft during the actual draft process. And it also means that in the games, you do have to consider those two cards that got removed from every pack. There's still possible options that could be in your opponent's pool, deck, and hand. So there's all this information that is rewarding to keep track of everything that's going on, and having some of it not be 100% clear definitely increases the replayability and the fun and the strategy of it. And this is not to say that any other two-player draft method doesn't have these things going for it, doesn't have some other aspect that makes it good. A lot of other people draft different ways. I've certainly played plenty of other two-player draft formats. I started doing Winston when I was first getting into Cube, done a lot of grid drafts. I remember really liking grid draft when I first discovered it, and I've played a number of the others, and maybe you have one that you like more. And I'm not going to try to take anything away from any other way to draft with two players. Cube is great, however you enjoy doing it, it's how you should do it. I just want to highlight this is the way to draft with two that I really like. I think it's really simple to teach and learn while also having a lot of strategic depth as well. So if I ask you if you want to play a two-player cube, there's sort of an implicit assumption that Minneapolis draft is what I mean. I'm going to start shuffling, I'm going to make 8-7 card packs. Hell, I might even make your 8-7 card packs for you so we can play. I do want to note that I have not ever tried to use Minneapolis Draft to draft cubes that are larger than 180 cards. I have some friends that have done that with their 360 or 540 card cubes. They said that they have enjoyed the methodology, which is great. I can't really speak to it confidently, but I have gotten good feedback. This was personally designed for 180 card cubes, and that is what my experience is going to be. That is what I am going to be reporting as enjoying. But I have heard you can use this for larger cubes. It might not be the best way to draft larger cubes. I cannot speak too confidently to that. But I can confidently claim that Minneapolis drafting 180 card cubes is an absolute blast. And then I want to offer real quick that because you're not drafting the entire cube when you use a Minneapolis draft, it can come to pass, certainly in the early versions of a cube, maybe the first time you draft it, that you draft your 8 packs and one or both of you are like, I don't really know if I can build a deck that's going to be consistent, that I'm going to enjoy playing. You can always add a pack or two to the draft. Really easy to set up and just do that and kind of feel it out that way. Once your design gets to a point where it is just generally fun and in the place where you want it to be, I think that 8-7s works really well, but it's a number you can modulate, and you can modulate in either direction. Maybe you want to go on hard mode and use fewer packs. It's certainly something that you can do. So you feel free to play with that. The method works really well with 8-7s, but then you can modulate to your personal preferences as well. And then one last point on Minneapolis Draft and 180 card cubes before I move on to 4-player drafts. I do want to reinforce and draw attention to something I talked about last week when I was talking about designing the individual colors for 180 card environments, and I talked a little bit about the 23 card 17 basic land monocolor deck, or just generally making sure that all the cards of one color generally play well with each other. That is something that does matter quite a bit when you're drafting Minneapolis Draft with a 180 card cube, because you do only get 40 cards. And looking at 7 card packs, having 5 colors in Magic and 2 players, it kind of invariably happens. Just mathematically, you're going to end up with some cards that are off color, and strategically, sometimes you're going to speculate, or like a color will dry up. Maybe your first pick doesn't line up with the rest of the draft. There's a lot of reasons that you're going to end up with some off-color cards. And doing your best to make it so cards of one color are mostly going to play well with cards in that same color helps to ensure that everybody ends up with a playable deck. It's really not fun when one player only ends up with like 20 coherent playables. Mana fixing is certainly an aspect of this as well, but just kind of making sure that your environment is generally tight and appealing and playable, and so every card slot is used as a playable game piece is pretty important to actually facilitating fun games in my experience. All right, moving on to four-player drafts now. I do remember at some point Parnell and I talked about this on the 540, and he said that in his group they do four-player drafts with three 15-card packs, which you can just do. Just treat it like an eight-player retail limited draft. Three 15s, passing left, right, left. And that technically works. My preference is for five 9-card packs. And the reason for that is that I think that the more times you see the same pack, the less interesting and fun it is. When you do five 9-card packs, you get a first pick, then the pack's going to come back to you twice. The second time you see it, 3 cards will be removed, so it's kind of interesting to think about what 3 cards are the other 3 players going to take, what can I realistically wheel, and then the second time you get the pack back, there's only 1 card left. There's not a ton to think about there. When you open it, it's worth considering, okay, what's the last pick? Can I actually make use of the last pick in this pack? And there's something fun and interesting there. And it's awesome when you actually do get to play the 9th card out of a pack. That's actually really fun. But then when you draft 3 15s, you're going to be seeing the same pack 4 times, and the last time you see it, there's going to be 3 cards in the pack. And usually it's the case that it's not that much different from a last pick. It's going to be 3 cards that are not very appealing. You know, everybody has had 3 cracks at already drafting out of this pack, so the leftovers are just usually not that exciting. And it's like, how many more times do I need to see this same pack? It's a lot more excitement, it's a lot more energy, I find, doing the 5 9s. You get more first picks, and you spend less time picking through the dregs of a booster pack. In his cube, it's not like the cards are bad, it's just way less exciting when you get to the tail end of those 15-card packs you've already seen a couple times, and if you were trying to draft anything still in that pack, you had multiple opportunities to have already drafted it. It's usually just stuff that's not going to fit for the specific draft you're doing right now. I think there's just more excitement, there's more fun in having more first picks, opening more packs, and you also spend less time in the tail end of a pack. And I think that it is a small but a meaningful quality of life improvement. When you get your 9th pick, it's just you get 1 card, you put it in your pool. Spending time looking at the 7 remaining cards of a 15-card pack or the 3 cards that come the last time, it's just not that fun or engaging. You're just kind of having that pack drag on. The 5 9-card packs kind of gives you exactly as much time as you want to spend with a pack in a 4-player draft, I find. And then a sillier aspect that I really like, with 3 15s you draft left, right, left, and then with 5 9s you draft left, right, left, right, left. And every time somebody is confused in a draft, it's the kind of thing that happens kind of no matter how many packs you're drafting with how many players, somebody's going to ask, hey, which way is this pack is going? Or somebody passes a pack in the wrong direction and they're corrected. And every time that happens, I get to say left, right, left, right, left. And I think that that is really fun. It's just enough longer than the usual left, right, left that it just sounds silly. I don't know. It's a good time. Try saying it. Left, right, left, right, left. Okay, back to more serious matters. Something that Wizards of the Coast has been working on rolling out recently is what they call Pick 2 Draft. Pick 2 Draft is a method intended for 4 players where you draft 3 15-card packs, passing left, right, left, and the idea in the name, pretty clear, you're going to draft 2 cards at a time. So in a retail booster, technically there's 14 cards in a basic land, so you're just going to draft 2 cards 7 times. This is something that I've tried in Cube. We did the 3 15s and we did pick 2 instead of actually just taking 1 card the way you would normally used to draft with 3 15-card packs. And I will say it was more fun to draft 2 cards at a time as opposed to doing 3 15-card packs 1 at a time for 4, because that does move you away from that problem where you're spending more time getting past a pack you've already seen multiple times, taking 1 card you don't really care about. It just works out better mathematically, it goes quicker, and I think that it's generally more fun. So if you want to do 3 15s or like bigger packs for smaller groups, I do think the Pick 2 Draft is an improvement on that. I was saying, though, I really like getting 1 first pick and just the general feeling of that for drafting in relation to Minneapolis Draft, but that's also true for 4-player drafts. So my absolute preference, I like 5 9-card packs. And then if I was going to draft 315s, I would do pick 2 draft because I think that 315s drafting 1 card at a time with 4 is just less fun and engaging than other ways that I have tried. So I would firmly put drafting 1 card at a time with 315s in last place. I think pick 2 draft is a very reasonable and a fun and kind of exciting way to approach drafting 315s. And then my preference is for 5 9-card packs, but your mileage may vary. And maybe you also have a wackier way that you engage with 4-player drafts. For me, once you get up to a certain player threshold, 4, 6, 8, I do like getting it as close to a regular draft experience as possible. Small number of packs being passed, left, right, left, right, left. And just kind of emulating as close to traditional retail booster draft as possible, just so there's not more stuff to learn. More rules is kind of the biggest barrier to hosting a fun game night, so I try to avoid that stuff as much as possible. And then the last thing that I want to talk about today is the significance of drafting a 180 card cube with 4 players. Whether you're using 315 card packs or 5 9 card packs, you will be drafting all 180 cards. And drafting 4 players is going to very quickly stress test your design. I actually used to really hate 4-player drafts, but that's coming from a time when I was drafting 360 card cubes or cubes larger than that. So when you drafted with 4, you were drafting half of the cube or less, so you just wouldn't see as many of the synergies, as much of the mana fixing, just a lot of reasons your deck wouldn't come together, and you were settling for drafting with 4 when you really wanted to be drafting with 8. Drafting with 4 with a 180 card cube, I've actually found to be really fun. When I first built the original recipe tuber, we spent a lot more time doing Minneapolis drafts, kind of seeing how that methodology ticked and learning more about just how small cubes worked and how to play them with 2 players. And then when I built the tempo tuber is when we really started doing 4-player drafts. And that design changed a lot when I started doing those 4-player drafts. When you're drafting, you see, okay, what are the last picks? Of course, every draft size style is going to have last picks, but it doesn't take nearly as long to do a 4-player draft with a 180 card cube, just because it's so quick to shuffle and reset when you're done, and you're just playing with the same cards. All the cards are present, so you see what cards are going last in every draft. You quickly learn the last picks, and then you play. We did a lot of round robins. You play 2, maybe 3 matches, and you see the power level outliers in your cube in action. You see what's happening in the games, and you get to see every deck drafted in action against every other deck, or at least 2 of the 3 decks usually. But back then we were doing just a lot more full round robins. And then it's important as you play those games to determine, okay, what's performing the best, which individual cards tend to take over games, and just making sure that there's a healthy amount of interaction. Do you have the right tools in your cube to interact with these things? Do you have other things that are comparably powerful? Maybe they would come together with a little bit more support, and you really get a lot of information very quickly about how your environment works and how you can make adjustments. Something that I think is very cool is when you start doing a lot of 4-player drafts, you get a feel for some cards that can more significantly show up in some drafts than others. Maybe there's a card that is really strong if you get it as a first pick, or you could hedge against and hope to see later, but it really changes the shape of the draft when it shows up early. A good example of this is in the Tempo Tuber. For a while I had Bloodbraid Elf, and there was kind of a Jund deck, but it just didn't show up too often. It mattered a lot to get the Bloodbraid Elf early, because otherwise you had a lot more access to card advantage and the ability to play long games in blue. So there was less reason to move in on red-green early in the draft unless you specifically saw the Bloodbraid Elf. So kind of seeing that stuff in action is really cool. Now, the ultimate takeaway of it really mattering where Bloodbraid Elf showed up in the draft was that there was too much appeal to blue. I had too much card advantage going on there. It made too much sense to draft blue early, and for even 2 or 3 of the seats at the table to be blue, and there was not enough support for some of the other colors. The cube is very different now. I've changed a lot of stuff in green to make it generally more appealing. A lot of stuff has moved around. And at the time, I just really wasn't sure what to do with the information that I was getting, so I didn't immediately figure out, okay, blue is too strong. Like, I liked that blue was strong, even if it was maybe at the expense of the design, and I didn't like that green was weak, but it took some time to correct that. And today I've moved that in both directions. Blue has a little bit less strength, green has more. But the point stands that the decks drafted from a given 4-player draft of 180 card cube are more instructive than even the decks drafted from an 8-player draft of a 360 card cube. You learn a lot about the environment, and then what you do with that information is up to you. And because you're drafting all the cards with 4 players, if you haven't really thought about it or experienced it, I do want to highlight how different that is even from drafting a 360 card cube with 8 players. You have all the cards there, but then there's more reasons why the decks might be disjointed or line up in weird ways. If you have one player really train wreck in an 8-player draft, the immediate seats around them, they're going to get weird signals, they're going to get weird cards passed. There's reasons that one seat can really disrupt the draft in a way that makes multiple decks at the table weaker, multiple decks at the table stronger, just kind of ends up with weird stuff that you really kind of need a larger sample to see what's going on. With only 4 players worth of variance, like somebody could kind of train wreck the draft, but usually if somebody is struggling in a 4-player draft, a 180 card cube, it more commonly means that everybody's a little bit confused because the cards just don't have to travel very far. You know, especially with these 180 card designs where all of the cards are meant to be playable and usable game pieces with all the other cards of the same color, things can only get so weird with the way that I've been designing this and with the way that we play these. So you learn about your environment very quickly, and I love that aspect. When I'm changing cubes, I really like that I can change one card and it'll actually have a significant aspect on the environment. That's a huge part of the appeal of small designs for me. I really love messing with constructed decks. I play a lot of 60-card Magic. That's really how I got into the game in a big way. And tinkering with my deck and seeing the impact of a couple small changes is something that I find very satisfying. And you lose that when you look at larger cubes. Or I guess maybe I should say you gain that when you look at smaller cubes. So that's really fun for me. I know other designers and groups are going to value the variance and kind of the range of things that could possibly happen being wider, but for me, I find this stuff very enjoyable. It's easier to understand and approach the environment, and I value that very highly. Okay, secret bonus aside, because it's something that people do ask me about from time to time, is how to draft with 3 players. And I think that when a lot of people ask this, the idea is you draft with 3 players and then play 2-player games. And I've got to say, I'm just not interested enough in that to really have good insights on a good draft methodology for drafting with 3 players to play 2-player games. However, a topic that I plan to cover in the future on the podcast is I think that multiplayer Magic is actually really fun, and just playing a 3-player game, everybody has 20 life, just playing a 3-player free-for-all is a pretty fun thing to do. I've actually been playing a decent number of 3-player games recently. It's with a little bit of a wackier environment. I've posted about it on Blue Sky. It's called the Omniscient Stack, so it's a weird cube where you have 3 card hands and you can cast all your spells for free, so it lends itself a little bit more to that multiplayer wackiness. And then it's also easier to set up that cube because there's no lands. You just kind of grab 40 random cards, and it's pretty easy to shuffle up and play a 3-player game. But I am inclined to believe if you wanted to play a 3-player free-for-all, just a quick sealed deck is a pretty fun way to do that. And with the general structure of my 180 card cube designs, where all of the cards are kind of supposed to be generally playable and cards of a color can typically play with cards of that color, and there's a good clip of mana fixing, I think that everybody getting 60 cards of the 180 is sufficient to build reasonable steel decks and play a quick game that way. If you're trying to play the best games, I do generally bias myself towards just drafting with 2, and you can take turns doing a full draft. It really does not take that long to do a full Minneapolis draft. That's another one of the really nice aspects of 180 card cubes. They just shuffle so quickly. And you can take turns doing a full draft. Again, that is one of the appeals of the smaller cube size. It is really quick to shuffle up and reset. So just taking turns, or if you're into it, and I am into it, playing a quick multiplayer game is a really fun way to play some Magic. Whatever your feelings about Commander, there is something going on there. Playing multiplayer games of Magic is fun. That's how I got into the game at first at the kitchen table. And if you've never tried it, I would urge you to consider trying it. It's a good time. And that's going to do it for my surface level look at drafting with 2 or 4 for 180 card cubes. I hope that you enjoy what you heard today. Maybe this is stuff that's a refresher. Maybe it's some stuff that you're hearing for the first time. This was definitely a topic that I wanted to tackle here on the new podcast. And whether you are somebody who is just starting your journey with 180 card cubes or you've been playing them for years now, I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I'd also appreciate you taking the time to like, subscribe, share, all that stuff, blah, blah, blah. Feed the algorithm, feed the horrible, stupid algorithm. But thank you for listening, and thank you for sharing. And I'll be back next week talking more Cube. Later, gamers.